I've often been asked this question in public forums at the end of a talk. And the first thing to say is it seems, doesn't it, very arrogant to say that people are going to hell simply because they're of the wrong religion or that they're of no religion. Is God going to say to people ultimately, you're not in because you just ticked the wrong box on the census? I think one of the things that's worth saying is that the thing that keeps us from God, and ultimately the thing that will keep us from the presence of God beyond death, is not our religion, but ultimately what the Bible calls our sin. That's the stuff in our lives that's wrong, the way that we've lived our lives really with independence from God, either implicitly or explicitly living as if God didn't exist. And the Bible says that it's that is the barrier between us and God, and it's that would ultimately separate us from God for eternity. But of course, the wonderful message of the Bible is that that isn't the final end of the story, that there is an opportunity for that sin to be overcome. There is a way in which that barrier can be dealt with. And in the cross of Christ and in the death of Jesus, we see that sin, that barrier has been dealt with, that Jesus made it possible for us to be forgiven, brought into a relationship with God, so that we don't have to end up with what we deserve, which would be separation from God ultimately in hell, but we can have what we don't deserve, an offer of God's grace, the presence of God now, and ultimately the reality of God's presence in a new creation in the future. And that is what Jesus died to achieve and what his resurrection shows is true. Now, I want to say to people, if it was possible for my religious efforts in whatever religion I choose to follow to be enough to overcome that barrier of my sin, or if my own moral goodness was enough to overcome that problem of my sin, then of course it's not necessary for me to know Jesus. I just need to try harder, be more religious or be more moral. But actually, I think the message of the Bible is that religious efforts and moral efforts alone are never going to be enough to overcome that divide, that barrier. And that's why we need Jesus. And that's why God has offered Jesus to us. And the wonderful thing is that is offered to everyone without exception. The only thing ultimately that would separate us from God is our own reluctance and unwillingness to respond to the invitation of God's forgiveness in Jesus. But he offers and extends that to everyone. And wonderfully, that is something we can receive. So I would say God doesn't want anyone to go to hell. In fact, the Bible talks about God taking no pleasure in the death of the wicked. It talks about how God is grieved by that. We see Jesus weeping over those people who had rejected him and rejected his message. It breaks the heart of God, because actually sin at its heart is not just breaking rules, it's breaking God's heart. But wonderfully, we see the joy that God has in seeing people come back into relationship with him through Jesus. And, as I said, that's open to everyone. And the definition of a Christian, of course, is not someone who was born in Europe or a certain country or someone who had certain parents. The definition biblically of a Christian is someone who's come to experience the forgiveness of Jesus through the cross of Christ. And wonderfully, we're seeing today people coming to that experience all over the world. And in fact, think about where the church is growing most rapidly in the world today. It's not in Europe, in fact. It's not in countries that we might call historically Christian. It's in places like Algeria, it's places like Nepal, it's places like Iran, where the church is growing exponentially. Not with Western-style Christianity, but with people who've come to discover the treasure of Christ and the wonder of that. So in a sense, you might say the Christian faith is exclusive. Yes, it is. It's only through Jesus that we can have this offer of life. But in one sense, it's also wonderfully inclusive, because this offer of life in Jesus is for everyone. And history shows, and present reality shows, that there are people of every culture who are coming to experience that. And the Bible points forward to a wonderful day in the future where there'll be people from every tribe and tongue and nation who've come to experience that forgiveness in Jesus and the offer of life that he brings.